Hello and welcome to the Emma's for Mama podcast. I'm your host, Abby Halberstadt, happy wife, mama to 10, Bible-believing Christian. And on today's episode, I get to dive into a really important conversation with my friend Alisa Childers. It's important for you listeners, but also for your kids, ages middle school all the way up to young adult, for helping them understand lies of culture and combat them with biblical truth. I think you're going to get a lot out of the conversation, but before I dive in, I have a perfect podcast sponsor for you for this topic, because Summit Ministries helps young people in their summer programs, ages 13 to 25, to answer life's big questions about abortion, about gender, about why evil exists in the world. And if you would like your student to have that opportunity to go, you can use the code MAMA26 for $250 off of their enrollment in either their Colorado or their Georgia location. You can head to summit.org/MAMA and use the code MAMA26 to register and save. I have a treat for you today. My friend Alisa Childers is back on the show. Alisa and I have had the opportunity to speak together at several events, and I just always appreciate her viewpoints on things, the way she speaks with clarity and kindness, and sense of humor, crunchiness, we have all kinds of things that we connect on. Alisa, thanks for being on the show.
It's so fun always. And yeah, I'm way crunchier than I think people know.
Yeah. Way crunchier than I am. My motto is I'm crispy at best.
I like that. Yeah.
I think I'm crispy or crunchy by default because I kind of grew up that way. So a lot of things that people have really strong convictions about are just my normal, because my mom was kind of a crunchy granola homeschool 90s mom. And then I may be crunchy by laziness. I don't want to go get prescriptions. I don't want to I don't want them, if I'm completely honest. But I also am one more thing to keep track of. No, we're just going to eat some more garlic.
Yeah, seriously. Well, that's funny because I grew up really, really healthy. In fact, I always joke with my mom that I didn't even have sugar really till I was 7. Even at my 7th birthday, my mom made a healthy spice banana cake for my birthday party that she sweetened with honey and that sort of thing. So I actually really appreciate that because I like healthy food. I love vegetables. I also have a sweet tooth. But yeah, I've sort of been on this progression of crunchy ever since my young adulthood. I feel like my soul has always just been a farmer, even though I grew up in the, more of the suburbs of Los Angeles. And so I'm now living my dream on a 5-acre farm with bees and chickens and growing stuff. So I love it.
That's amazing. And I'm laughing because, of course, with your Zoe Girl days where you were wearing pleather and sequins and polyester, and now you've got no shoes on and natural fibers. That's awesome. That is a progression for sure.
Yes.
Well, I want to talk to you today about, a variety of topics. I'm sure that to some extent we will wend our way through a variety of things. But your first book was called Another Gospel, and you were essentially breaking down what happened to you when you were faced with progressive ideas and how they kind of rocked your theological world. And a lot of my listeners will have read that book, but not all. And last time you were on, we were talking about the idea of deconstruction and your book about deconstruction. So let's rewind and kind of give an overview of Another Gospel to those that aren't familiar with it and kind of where that came about.
Well, Another Gospel is really what I would call my theological memoir. So it's the story of me after, you mentioned I was in Zoe Girl, contemporary Christian music, Spice Girls, basically, loving Jesus my whole life, always loved the Lord. And it really wasn't until I was an adult, till that was done, that we found ourselves at a church that was just a local non-denominational church, and we loved it. And after several months of attending there, the pastor invited me to be a part of this kind of side class. And I didn't know this at the time. In fact, I didn't even know this when I wrote Another Gospel. I only found this out a few years ago when he made a video about what was going on at the church at the time. But he was actually already deconstructed, and he was already a progressive Christian. And so he was doing all these little side classes to try to deconstruct the people in his church so that he knew that if he could deconstruct them, then he could probably more easily convert them to progressive Christianity. And so he was really good at it. And so I tell that story of watching member after member in my class either walk completely away from the faith at all or redefine it in a way that made it unrecognizable. And then this led me to a really dark faith crisis, dark night of the soul, and ultimately the story of how God used studying apologetics, theology, church history, all sorts of stuff to rebuild my faith, and really ultimately busting it down to the absolute studs and then building back up. And so through the process of that book, though, I walk through the basic beliefs of progressive Christianity, and it's kind of mostly from a theological perspective, just the actual gospel of progressive Christianity. But there's a lot more to it we could talk about, but that was kind of the gist of Another Gospel.
So I think when you and I are kind of in this whole field of talking about ideas, of talking about theology, of talking about influence of culture, like where are some of these kind of tenets that we see creeping into Christianity, creeping into the minds of people who were maybe not raised with any kind of progressive ideologies, but they start holding them without even realizing it. One of the things that I get asked a lot is, can you define that for me? Because when you talk about and think about these things a lot, you start to assume everybody is doing the same, and that's usually not true. So give me a nutshell definition of progressive Christianity and how it contrasts with historical biblical Christianity.
Okay, I'm going to give you like a triangle. I do this, I do it differently every time. I feel like my definition is always changing because progressive Christianity, well, the simplest definition I could give you is that it's the view that Christianity itself is progressing. So it's like a completely different animal. You know, you think traditionally Christians have biblical authority, we have creeds, we have these sort of statements of faith that say, okay, we're on the same page about what the essentials are, what this thing actually is. Progressive Christianity just does not even work that way. It's uses the label Christian, but it really can mean kind of whatever you want it to mean. So the way I think it's helpful to think about it is like a three-pronged approach, almost like a triangle. So there's a theological angle, there is a cultural or ethical angle, and then there's a political angle. And all three are very strongly represented in progressive Christianity. So the theology of progressive Christianity would basically say that they're not really united about what they would affirm in the positive sense, but they're very united on what they deny. So if you think about the narrative arc of the gospel, virtually all progressive Christian thought leaders are going to deny that humans are inherently sinful, that sin separates us from God, that the sacrificial death of Jesus was necessary, that his resurrection was physical. And then, of course, if you don't have a physical resurrection, you don't have an ascension, you don't have a second coming, all of that becomes kind of metaphorical, which leads really to just universalism.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the theology piece. But then there's this ethical and cultural piece that also overlaps with some political. So you have a very strong emphasis on social justice and identity politics, critical theory, critical race theory. And then a very kind of in that umbrella as well would be a very strong focus on environmental activism, LGBTQ plus activism. And that sort of is connected then with the political angle, which progressive Christians, there was this study done actually several years ago through a book called One Faith No Longer, where sociologist George Yancey, among other things, determined that progressive Christians are actually politics first, and then their theology is going to flow downstream from their politics. And so I wanted to answer your question that way because you mentioned like, how can this be seeping into different places? Like just this week, I'll give you an example. I've been sort of concerned about the drift at Biola University.
Oh, no.
And so one of the people that they brought in is a guy named Rich Viodas. And aside from the fact that he is heavily promoting people like Richard Rohr, who I have no hesitation saying is a heretic, he heavily promotes James Cone. He says that he was very shaped by liberation theology. And this is somebody Biola brought in for a spiritual formation night. So I was just kind of letting people know about that on X. But the post was very tricky for people because he was talking about caring for the poor, which is a Christian value.
Yes.
But he was basically relating that with the SNAP benefits, potentially being lost.
Right.
And how if you're going to be a Christian, you have to basically be for, SNAP benefits and welfare and all of these things. And that's where that political stuff can really overlap with the social justice stuff. And it can be tricky because on paper, you might go to his website and he might say, well, I believe humans are sinners and they need a savior, and that, he might affirm that, but it's all this other stuff that's coming in that can be very confusing. So you kind of have to think about all three angles when assessing if there is a drift, because that is how it works. It's a drift. It's not like progressive Christians are like, hey, we want to convert you to progressive Christianity. They just sort of start sneaking these ideas in, and they can sound good at first, and especially if other boxes are checked in the right way. And so it can be very confusing.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be true. And when you were talking about your mentor, the teacher at your former church that kind of introduced you to progressive Christianity and then introduced you ultimately to this crisis of faith that, praise God, the Lord brought you through. One of the things that you said is you did not realize at the time, because he didn't say up front, I have deconstructed. I no longer identify as a historical Christian. I am something other. Because obviously, that would probably be a little too on the nose to convert anybody to anything. But
Right.
your impression is that he was actively trying to do so and that he knew what he was doing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that's not even my impression. That's the fact of what he said he was doing
Okay.
when he produced a video a few years ago. And he said, it's almost, I mean, this is a bit of a paraphrase because I don't have the quote right in front of me, but he basically said, I knew that if I could just get them into the pipeline of deconstruction, they would be more easily converted by me to progressive Christianity, because he thought that's what was better for them. And Abby, I remember, 3 months into the class when I started to realize what was going on, because honestly, I didn't know what was happening at first. I thought, is he trying to play devil's advocate to try to get us to spot deception? It was so confusing, because then you would talk to him on the side and he would affirm all the things that you believe. And then he would be this other guy. So I remember about 3 months into the class, he said to my class, he said, I've pretty much changed my beliefs, but I keep not saying it on Sunday. So on Sunday, he would give these kind of more orthodox biblical sermons. And he said, what do you guys think? Should I start being more honest with the people, or should I? And I was utterly shocked to hear him say that, because that was the first time I heard him really admit that he was doing that. But what really surprised me was that other people in the class who he had really successfully deceived were saying, yeah, you should just be honest. Everybody will be with you. This is great. Like, they were just so excited about this new kind of Christianity that he had led them into. And they wanted him to go ahead and tell everybody else. And so actually, he didn't even do that for like 7 more years. So even after my family left the church, it took 7 years before he actually came out and said that he was LGBTQ plus affirming and that he was a progressive Christian. And when he did that, it split the church in half, because half of the people still had no idea what he really believed.
And of course, the interesting thing is that there was a kernel of truth in what the people who were saying you should come out and be honest were saying, in the sense that we should not, as Christians, be affirming one thing with one side of our mouths and then thinking, acting, and believing and saying to a different group of people another thing. That's called a double-minded man, which James tells us is unstable in all his ways. And so that should have not been a good thing for people to hear, that he was publicly declaring, I am saying this to appease this crowd. I'm saying this to appease this crowd. Because that is not what Paul is talking about when he talks about being all things to all people.
Right.
Because
right.
his goal is always that Christ is preached and that he's preached faithfully. So with that background in mind, you have another version of another gospel, which is aimed at students. So give me an age range that you wrote this version of another gospel for.
Yeah, thinking like middle school through college, kind of that's Gen Z, basically the Gen Z generation. And I'm extra excited about it today, because just this morning I finished recording the audio version and I just went way off script. I had so much fun with it. Like, I did all these little side notes for the listeners that aren't even in the book, where I'd, explain something further or tell a story. And so I just had so much, like, how would I read this book to my to my kids who are
Yeah.
teenagers, So I had a lot of fun with that and just getting to read through it all again. And it's similar to the first book. So the bulk of the material is the same, but we updated some of the examples to be more relevant to Gen Z. We added discussion questions at the end of each chapter. And then we kind of did these little sidebars to help explain things further. Like we had this one sidebar where we were explaining who some of these early church fathers were that I quote in the book. Like, okay, here's who Irenaeus was. Here's who Clement of Alexandria was. And so I had a lot of fun working. I had an editor who is in Gen Z kind of go through it and help me with some of that stuff. So I'm really excited about it.
I love that. And I'm kind of jealous that you got to do all these asides in your book, because every time I've read my books, they've been like, if you must make an amendment, only like if it says something about reading, and they're like, then you should say listening, and that's right. About as much wiggle room as I get.
So what's so fun about that is I've had that same experience, because that's kind of what I've always wanted to do with my books, but I could just tell it was generally frowned upon.
Yeah.
But this time, I just recorded it myself in my studio.
Okay.
And so I just didn't ask permission. I just did it.
You just did it. I love that.
I just did it.
I have actually considered doing that for my next book, that I might just go rogue and record it myself, because
you should.
I should. Let's just do it.
Let's do it.
I have 5 teenagers in my house right now. So I'm 100% smack in the middle of the age demographic that you are aiming at with this book. And my question for you, I think I already know an answer that I would give, but my question for you is, why do you think this age needs it so much?
Well, I think that, we're all talking about this vibe shift we're seeing in culture, and we're seeing Gen Z trend more conservative, which is really great. Like, I'm really excited about what I'm seeing among especially young men who are seeking the Lord. And yet at the same time, though, I think a lot of people kind of let their guards down with things like progressive Christianity, because what we have to bear in mind is the colleges, and in particular, the Christian colleges, like we just mentioned, Biola, are really drifting progressive. That's the trend. So even though you might have a high school student who is maybe invigorated with conservative politics or even conservative theology, complementarianism, all of those things, if they're going to be going to a Christian college, there's a really good chance that they're going to be hit in the face with progressive ideas that aren't going to be presented as progressive ideas. Because even in the conservative Bible seminaries, we have a lot of drift into progressive theology. Wheaton is very much drifting left. Biola, there's tons of other ones. And so I think that's one reason, just to get them prepared, but also because progressive Christianity can actually, on that, that 3-pronged approach of the triangle, the cultural and ethical part can actually be sort of brought in under conservative banner. So, like, for example, we've all seen gay conservatives, right? We're seeing gay political conservatives. Well, some of those even claim to be Christians. So really what they are progressive Christians who are conservative politically. And so I think it's really important more than ever that our kids primarily know how to spot the theology, because as Christians, what we think about God, how we study God, what we think about the Bible, the person of Jesus, what the gospel is, our political and ethical and cultural views will flow downstream from that. And so for our young people to give them that really solid theological base, like these are the essentials, these are the things we can't agree to disagree about, is a good foundation for whatever they're going to be doing next. If they're going to be in the workforce, or if they're going to college or getting married or whatever it might be, to be able to spot the theology. And I think that's a very much a protective measure when they're going to be encountering ideas that are kind of progressive Christian on both sides of the political aisle.
I love that you are getting out there ahead of this trend that you see, that I also have seen. And it is so difficult to be discerning, to choose between right and almost right, when you hear people on social media who are espousing a lot of the same values that you hold, but then when it comes to theology, they are diametrically opposed to the way that God has made them in terms of sexuality, or maybe the way I've seen some conservative Christian female accounts, like women's accounts, where there's a huge focus on appearance, So there's a lot of
Yes.
focus on making conservatism sexy. Like that's kind
Yes.
of the vibe.
Yes.
And obviously that's in direct contrast to the word of God, which tells us that certain parts of our body receive special honor and special covering, that our attitudes are to be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself humble to the point of death on a cross. Those are not conservative ideals. Those are biblical ideals. And if our foundation is not that, it's so easy to get off in the weeds of trying to make something about the conservative movement look more appealing from a worldly perspective. And that's happening with like millennials. That's happening with
Hmm.
mid-30s women who are like, listen, I don't want to be associated with the trad wife movement. I don't want to be a homeschool mom. I don't want to be one of those crazy people, but I do want to, whatever it is, have less taxation or less government control or less crime, or that's kind of, you start melding all these things.
Yeah.
So if it's hard for adults to spot, it's going to be really hard for kids to reconcile that mixed messaging. And I often find myself these days, especially with social media and conservative social media, thinking, is this because you truly believe this? Or is this because it's selling and the clickbait is working?
Wow.
And like, is there a deeply, so I love what you're saying about everything should be downstream from our theology, from who we know God to be, from his actual presence and transformation in our lives.
Yeah.
Um, you actually teach classes. Do you still teach classes at Summit?
I do. I every summer I've gotten to go at least once. They do like I think 7 or 8 of them,
Mm-hmm.
and so every summer in the last few years I've gotten to at least go once or twice each summer, and I love it.
So what are your topics that you kind of feel are the ones that young people are resonating the most with these days? Is it a lot about progressivism?
Well, when I go to Summit, I typically do. I spend a good bit of time on my story and my testimony because I really like to connect with the kids first and hopefully give them something to kind of latch onto, saying, I understand what it's like to grow up in a Christian home and go to church all the time and all of these things. And then typically what I'll talk about is deconstruction and progressive Christianity. And what's interesting, Abby, is that each year that I go back, I'll always ask them first. I love teaching at Summit because it's so interactive. Like I don't just do like a presentation. I actually ask them questions
Yeah.
and kind of, it's how I like to teach. I do that at Impact 362. And I'll ask them, can somebody define progressive Christianity for me? And the first year that I went, it was kind of all over the map. And, some of the definitions were close, but not quite. I'm telling you now, like 3 or 4 students in a row will define it even better than I can.
That's
So
awesome.
so I know that they're engaged, like they're seeing it and they're having to think about it and they have thought about it. It's definitely something that they're facing. And so that's kind of what I've observed as the years go on that I get to go there.
I love that. And the fact that you kind of have your finger on the pulse of this demographic that this book is focused on. I want to ask you, because you said a lot of the philosophies of progressive Christians are downstream from their politics, not their theology. And I'll just say as a side note, I have found this to be very true kind of in the parenting sphere of gentle parenting or conscious parenting, all of the peaceful parenting. So often the progression, and I'm always a little, concerned with that word because progress sounds good,
Hmm.
and I think that's intentional that they're co-opting a generally positive word because it gives a better spin. But really, it's going back to the garden. It is not progress. It is regression back to the first kind of sinful, deceptive, twisted question that Satan asked to Eve, did God really say? Are you sure that he really means what he says? And the answer, of course, biblically is yes, he does. He never changes or wavers. But when I look at it from a parenting perspective and I see gentle parenting, which is very much so influenced, was in fact started by a progressive, not to the best of my knowledge, not even a professing Christian, just a progressive, someone who would, on the secular side of things, be very interested in a lot of the things that you've talked about, social justice and a very humanistic worldview. And the idea is that you want to produce a certain kind of child. Well, from a Christian perspective, our goal is to honor God. Our goal is to love God, love people, love our neighbors. Our closest neighbors are our children. And so we should be loving them well by teaching them what God says is true, because we can't be more loving than God. And to set ourselves up as truth seekers or truth knowers above God is to say, well, we love better than God because we understand truth better than God. And it's so interesting to watch the struggle for these parents as they become more and more progressive with the idea my children can't be inherent sinners, because that's a very harsh mindset about young children. And then if they're not inherently sinners, then do they really need a savior? How do I explain salvation to children when they are struggling with the belief, or they have been given the belief, that any misbehavior on their part stems from, and you'll probably recognize this for like ages well beyond small children, that any like misbehavior or mistakes, they don't use the word sin, of course, stem from an environmental impetus beyond their control, and that it's kind of somebody else's fault and not theirs. Do you see that within progressivism beyond small children?
100%, 100%. But even like what you're describing is exactly what progressive Christian, like children's pastors will say. I wrote about somewhere, I can't remember if it was an article or in one of the books, but there is a progressive children's pastor here in Nashville who wrote an article at Easter. And it was basically like how to talk to your kids about Easter. And the whole article was basically suggesting that if you tell kids that Jesus died on the cross for their sins, it's going to be psychologically damaging to them. Yeah. And the whole idea of resurrection, the whole idea of him having to die on the cross because of you and your sin, that's going to scar people. In fact, it's claimed, you asked about the older ages, it is claimed all over the deconstruction hashtag, all over progressive Christianity, that just being taught that you are inherently sinful is not just a toxic thing to be taught, but actually you were abused because you were taught these things. In fact, you know, it's so funny. Well, it's not funny. It was actually kind of difficult when I first found out about it, but there was a progressive scholar who wrote a whole book trying to refute my book, Another Gospel. And one of the things he claimed was that my parents abused me by teaching me these principles of the gospel. And I'm just like, it took me a minute to figure out why just being taught what obviously, and you believe is true, it reflects what's real in the world. It's an accurate diagnosis of what's wrong with the world. Human sin is what's wrong with the world.
Right.
But to be taught that in the mind of the progressive is to actually be abused. And then you have to do all this therapy. You have to do all of these things to heal from the abuse. This is why so many like adult children are cutting off their parents, not letting their parents see the grandkids, that sort of thing, because it's not just that they disagree with you. They actually think that you are abusive, harmful, unsafe, toxic, and they're trying to put a boundary between themselves and what they perceive to be toxic theology. And so this is something that is a huge issue. And I see it with gentle parenting too. I've learned a lot about gentle parenting from you. I recognized when I would go to the park with my kids when they were little that other parents were doing things I didn't understand, like not correcting their kids and kind of doing this, like Allie Beth would call toxic empathy. You know, it would make my kid uncomfortable to make him go apologize to somebody or admit that he was sinful in his action or something like that. Yeah. And I'll throw it back to you after this. But even at my old church where I had this class, there was a female children's pastor at the time. And one of the volunteers for Easter, this was, again, before people knew what was really going on. So you had kind of traditional Christians mixed in with progressive Christians. One of the more traditional Christians made bookmarks for all the kids on Easter that just said, Jesus died for my sins. And the children's pastor became infuriated. And she took all of the bookmarks and threw them in the trash. Oh my goodness. And just was like, how dare you tell kids something like this? And meanwhile, they're teaching the kids to do the whip and nay dance that was popular at the time. And no, what a mess, right? So yeah, it's like this toxic empathy that really just leads, I think, if we, as you well know, if we don't let our kids have some tension, have some discomfort, experience some even pain in certain times, that's the kind of stuff that makes them strong and resilient to be able to be productive members of society. And when you remove all those barriers, I think it's why we have so many kind of dysfunctional people who can't really handle any stress or this sort of thing. So yeah, it's all related to the sin nature, and it all comes back to that, I think.
Absolutely. And not only that, but when you just take it another layer into the really uncomfortable territory of the biblical definition of suffering and struggle and tribulation, where we're actually called to share in the sufferings of Christ. And we're supposed to, my kids and I are memorizing Philippians 2 right now, and we're memorizing the part. I always get all the translations muddled because I've learned it in multiple different translations. So I'll probably mix a couple, but we're supposed to look not only to our own needs, but to the needs of others and consider others' interest as more important than our own. That is anathema to a mindset that says it is impossible to be true to oneself if one does not assess, promote, care for, almost orbit oneself first, which is how we know that Christianity truly is unique. Not only is it unique in that it is the only belief system in which redemption is by grace and faith alone. There is nothing that we can do to contribute to that. There's nothing we can do to change our own sin status, but Jesus has already done it for us, of course, and we didn't contribute anything to that. Not only is that true, but there are so many beliefs that run obviously counter to how our sinful, selfish human nature wants to run, wants to head in this direction of, but, if I don't promote self, if I don't take care of myself. And every time I say this, somebody comes in and is like, Abby, we need to feed ourselves and take showers. I'm like, 100% agree.
Yeah, that's all right.
We're not talking about basic care of needs that helps us to function. There is no scriptural mandate ever to neglect your ability to function well so that then you can function well for others and care for others. But this idea, I write about this in You Betcha Stretch Marks in the last chapter, where I actually asked for feedback from business owners or people who had significant contact being the boss or the manager of the younger generation, so Gen Z, and what their impression was of exactly what you're talking about: resilience, absolute truth, taking responsibility for their actions, an understanding of like where trouble in the world comes from. I just kind of had some parameters I laid out, and I got the most interesting response from a fairly young mom. She has several children who are under 10, who was an owner of a coffee franchise in Colorado. So a pretty progressive state. And she was so compassionate and clear-eyed in how she talked about these young adults, teenagers and young adults, but also just so devastated at the state they were in, of a complete inability to even understand. So she said, for their business, there were no substances that were allowed in your system while you were working, which makes sense. You do not want to be high while you're trying to do your job.
Seems like a fairly, reasonable
yes,
expectation.
A pretty baseline expectation. And the kids would come and they would be caught doing weed in the bathroom or whatever. And interestingly enough, they weren't really hiding it because they didn't really get why they should have to follow boundaries. And she said this happened. It wasn't one kid. It was over and over again. They had been raised with the idea that you live your truth. And the logical extrapolation of living one's truth is to be very confused when someone else imposes something called absolute truth on you, right?
Yeah. It's so, I don't mean this to be a pivot because I think it's really related, but I just read Jen Hatmaker's new book. Can we talk about Jen Hatmaker with this?
Absolutely. Go for it.
It is like her main message is self, 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 self. So I actually just reviewed this book with Natasha Crane on our Unshaken Faith podcast, if anybody wants to go hear the whole review. But I kind of summarized what the book is about on X. And it's basically that Jen has basically located in her mind, the biggest oppressive force in her life, which is Christianity.
Mm.
Basically, everything her pastors ever told her, the Christianity she was taught, is the most oppressive thing in her life. So she has thrown that off and traded it for feminism, just this whole kind of meology. In fact, she has these me courses she talks about in the book. And this, I try to keep my attitude correct here because it's so out of touch with the average person. So the sad part of the book is that her husband cheated on her and left. And so it's kind of that story. So putting that aside, I'm not criticizing that. That's rough and that's
Right.
tough and it's
That's sin
heartbreaking.
against her. Yes.
Full stop. But the problem is that her answer is like she does this me camp where she spends a month in Maryland or so, I think it was Maryland, and just doing whatever she wants for 1 month, just whatever she wants to eat, whatever she wants to buy, whatever she wants. And I'm just thinking, first of all, it's so out of touch that most people just don't have the finances to be able to do that.
The time,
which is,
the schedule. No, that's not feasible.
So like, I don't even get that. But then like the whole message of her book is you have to listen to yourself. You have to trust your body. You have to go with your own instincts. You have to live your true authentic self. You have to become sexually liberated. Don't let them tell you have to wait till you get married to have sex. And I'm just thinking, it sounds like that's exactly what your husband did, and yet in the story, obviously that was horrible what she went through.
Yeah.
But really, if we just look at consistency, he's just living his truth. That's what he did.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's a very confused way to live. And I think it's a very unstable way to live. Now, the sad thing is this book sold like 100,000 copies in its first month or 2 weeks or a month. So women are eating this up. And then you think about, this is the age of women who are now grandmothers and mothers, and they're passing this on to the next generation. And it's honestly, it's like, it's kind of terrifying if you didn't know how sovereign God is.
That is such a good way of putting it because talk about a pivot. I may pivot yet again here, but I don't tend to be a super anxious personality for tomorrow kind of thing. People ask me a lot of times how I deal with the concept that at any point, any of my 10 children could be taken ill beyond my control and die, be in a car wreck. I was just telling my friend the other day about a story where my second oldest and then my first daughter, who's right after him, so 17 and 15, were driving home from homeschool co-op. Simon's driving the speed limit, doing everything he's supposed to be doing, and a white sports car decided to pull out in front of him with almost no room for him to stop whatsoever and start doing donuts in the middle of a 2-lane highway with 70-mile-an-hour speed limits, smoking his tires, just doing revolutions in the middle, which means there was no space for Simon to stay on the road. So he had to swerve off the road, almost went down in the median and flipped, miraculously did not, is about to T-bone himself on a highway sign, missed that by inches, got back on the road, and my daughter is watching this sports car do his last donut, and the tail of the car is swinging toward her, and she just said, "Mama, he was going to hit me. Like there's no way." And they both affirmed that they knew they were going to get hit. They knew it was going to be bad because the guy pulled out in front of them while they were going the full speed limit, and Simon could not slam on his brakes completely because he didn't want to, lose control of the car. So they're probably still going 55 miles an hour. And so Della is just praying and just waiting to be hit really hard by this car. And the tail of his car went past her car door by an inch. Wow. She said, "I don't know how he missed me." I mean, the Lord was so gracious. The Lord was so gracious. So I've actually been in a scenario where my kids came home and it was like they could have not, very easily could have not, because someone lived their truth, Alisa, because someone decided that day, this is what they wanted to do. This is what would fulfill them. This is the high that they wanted to feel. If they died and they took somebody else with them, oh well. And I mean, if that isn't an exemplification of where this kind of mindset leads. And I know someone's being like, wait a minute, you started talking about progressive Christianity and then you got onto some knucklehead who was probably high who decided to pull. But we have to be careful to reiterate, everything flows downstream of how we view God, whether or not he is our authority, whether or not there is one source of truth, how we interact with it, if we're in obedience and submission to that concept. So the real pivot that I wanted to jump off into real quick is the one thing that is kind of tweaking my little anxiety strings, plucking them a little bit. And that is a huge rise, not only sure in progressivism, but a very odd bedfellow, which is Islam. Because probably the one thing that I look into the future and feel the most uneasy about, that I see growing more and more, is a Muslim influence, particularly with Sharia law at its center. And I know that that isn't progressivism, but it's interesting that they're kind of pulling in the same direction, that you have progressives for Hamas, a terrorist
Queers for
organization.
Palestine.
Exactly. Where they would not be treated well in Palestine at all. So I think that there's, what did you say a little while ago? Something about it's a confusing mindset. It doesn't make a lot of sense. There's not a lot of logical.
It's not consistent. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's an interesting connection there, because that's the way you worded it too. It's like, I think I'm like you, where I don't worry so much about the future, but I have been thinking about Islam a lot, especially as we see it take over areas of Europe, and watching the horrific videos of the persecuted Christians in Nigeria under Islamic rule. And I think the scary thing is that, you can have Christians do horrible things in the name of Christ, but they're actually going against the teachings of Christ when they
100%.
do it. The thing with Islam is, I don't, the phrase radical Islam is really just what is called consistent Islam, because thankfully many Muslims, especially in the West, are moderate.
Yes.
They're really like progressive Muslims. And I'm actually thankful for that, because they're not following the teachings of their leader and what the Quran and the Hadith say. Because if they did, that the violence is what Islam actually teaches. And so when people become consistent Muslims, then it's subjugation by the sword or by taxation, and they have the right to take sex slaves and
whatever your hand can grab hold of is yours.
And we see the demonic violence of that. And it is scary. It is scary if you get your eyes off the cross for a moment, you're like, that's a really terrifying thought, especially if you have daughters and that sort of thing. And it's growing, and I think that it's a demonic sort of brilliant lie to get progressives to almost like this term Islamophobia. If you have any criticism of the teachings of Islam, if you have any criticism of, well, you're Islamophobic. And so you see these progressives rallying around okay, Abby, I talked with this mom at a event I was speaking at, and she was basically expressing how her daughter had deconstructed, had become, I think, trans, and was getting really swept up in this Queers for Palestine movement. And I said, have you asked her what would happen to her if she went there?
Yeah.
And she said, yes. And I said, does she understand that homosexuals are punished with the death penalty in Islamic areas? She does understand that. And I said, well, what did she make of that? And the mom said she doesn't care. Now, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I don't know how to make sense of that. Like, what is the ideology that trumps that? Knowing, you actually know, you're cognizant of the fact that if you went there, they would throw you off of a building, but somehow you still are seeing them as the oppressed. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one, but it is a brilliant demonic lie.
Yeah. And I think that because Satan is the father of lies, nothing thrills him more. I don't claim to know the mind of Satan, but it seems to me that it would be consistent that nothing would thrill him more than having two ideologies that should be diametrically opposed to each other, because you have live my truth, allow me to do whatever I want, and absolute control and really harsh measures against the very truth supposedly that they are fulfilling. These should not be bedfellows. And yet somehow people are deceived enough to hate only Christianity, to find repugnant the loving boundaries and definitions set forth by God and his holy word, but not do the same for coincidentally comparable definitions over in Islam that have disastrously different origins and results. They're not the same, but where there is kind of almost this copying or mimicry of Christianity in some aspects of Islam, it's a counterfeit, and yet you have progressives loving the counterfeit and hating the truth.
Well, you just put your finger on something. It's kind of like having a common enemy, even if you both are so different, but you have the same enemy. And the result of the critical theories of this oppressed versus oppressor narrative that I think a lot of people are just not, they don't get it. What's at the bottom of all of that is that Christians are the ultimate oppressor in that worldview. So people who are caught into that worldview see Christianity as it's expressed in the West and in entire Western civilization as an expression of white supremacy. So they see it as inherently racist. They see it as the force that has colonized the world. That's why you have to decolonize your theology.
Right.
So it's like they have this common enemy. Yeah, Islam's enemy is Christianity. Of course it is. Well, that's also the enemy of the critical theories. It's the greatest oppressor. So if they can come together, I mean, I'm just thinking this right now. I'm sure other people have thought of this before me, but if they can come together to unite against that common enemy, I think that is probably the goal. I think a lot of Christians they're just thinking, oh, critical race theory, just different ways to talk about race. But what they don't understand is that critical race theory is one little subset of the critical theories that view the entire Western civilization as inherently racist and needs to be toppled and brought down. Well, that Islam is going to be a perfect bedfellow for that.
That's very true. And so much of these things stem from Marxism, which is essentially saying the tenet that works so well now, even if someone doesn't want to openly proclaim themselves as a Marxist, is that there are groups of people who have power, and having power, if you've had it historically, and if you're white, and if you're a Christian, and if you're in the Western world, is assumed at this point to be a negative thing. And then if someone is rising in power in opposition to that, that is assumed to be a positive thing. You don't have to examine too closely what's actually happening to get people there, or what the actual results are, or whether it's destroying people's lives, as we see, for example, with the trans movement, and so many other kind of outflowing fingers of progressivism. But so can you talk a little bit about Marxism for those that aren't familiar, and kind of why all of this, a lot of what we're seeing today, whether it's feminism, whether it's gentle parenting, whether it is progressive Christianity or far left-leaning ideologies, kind of where that's coming from historically?
Yeah, so I'm learning a lot about this question right now because it's really hard to trace back what came first. But what I'm actually discovering through people like a friend of mine who just got her MDiv in, public theology, but with a specialty on feminism and standpoint theory, is that a lot of this stuff actually is traced back to feminism. Feminism is really at the root of so many of our problems. Like, I don't even think people realize that. And so you have like Marxism, which was an economic theory. But what I see the biggest outflow of Marxism today is the definition of justice. So biblically, justice, I have a whole talk on this because it's just so fascinating that we can be using that word justice and we can mean totally different things.
Right.
So biblically, justice is one of God's attributes. It's who he is. It's a word we use to describe God. And so it's his perfect moral character. It's his righteousness. Anything that falls short of that is an injustice. So we have to start there before we can think about how that's going to flow out socially, right? And social justice is just, I think we should totally leave that term behind because it has such a definition that is not biblical justice.
It's corrupted,
but
for sure.
It's totally corrupted. But if you look throughout the Bible, all throughout Old and New Testament, you have this sense of fairness. Justice is fairness. It's the correct punishment that meets the weight of the sin. It's the right reward that meets the good behavior. And that's all throughout the Bible. It's even in heaven. We will have different rewards. It's not that everybody's going to have the same thing. But in Marxism, the definition of justice is that everybody has the same outcome.
Same outcome.
And
Yep.
yeah, so in fact, I actually found an article on Harvard Law School's website, basically saying, Lady Justice is blind, equal weights and measures, but it shouldn't always be that way. And they were arguing for equity, which is not equality. Equity is equal outcome. And so that has flowed into everything. Although Marx was mostly applying that to economics, it is in the weeds. It is in everything. It's in theology. So this is why, for example, in progressive Christianity, in evangelicalism, you can have two Christians that might have a slightly different view on what a woman can or can't do in ministry. And we're going to go to scripture and we're going to have our debate and we're going to use the Bible as our authority. And at the end of the day, we're probably going to say, we agree to disagree. We're still brothers and sisters in Christ. Maybe we'll go to different churches or something. But in progressive Christianity, that is not how, for example, that topic would be approached. It's just assumed that because a woman might have a different outcome, that is not just like different theology, that's an actual injustice. So that's why in the ex-evangelical hashtag, in the progressive Christian movement, you have, for example, complementarianism equated with abuse and misogyny.
Yeah.
And so it's like a totally different definition of justice. And I think Marxism is responsible for that.
Yes. And I agree that a huge outflow of that is all of the different waves of feminism that we have kind of gone through, whether we've knowledgeably, like knowingly experienced them. We have been influenced. I was just typing up a post the other day, and I was looking up this quote by Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. And oh my goodness, I have not read the book in its whole at all, but just reading excerpts, you're like shaking your head. She had a quote that basically said something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, but I could look it up. I may put it in the show notes to get it right, but it was the effect of that those women who are satisfied with being, quote, just a housewife, which she uses almost as an insult, are the equivalent of those who went to the gas chambers in the Holocaust. Like, it is the same as the lamb to the slaughter, essentially, because she views being satisfied with being a keeper of your home and domestic affairs being your primary focus and concern as a death of self and identity. There can be no other interpretation. That's found nowhere in scripture. In fact, taking care of one's home and one's family and having one's ministry start there is a bedrock of how Christian women are to function, because just like, I can't remember his last name. I want to say it's William Wallace, but that's probably the Scottish guy. I'm gonna have to look up his name. I did. It was William Morris or something like that. He wrote the poem, "The Hand That Rots the Cradle." And this is not some creepy movie, about some crazy lady who kills people. It's the hand that rocks the cradle. The rest of it is rules the world. That used to be the view before feminism began to creep into the mindset of even conservative Christians and women who stay at home, who are so frustrated that they have to deal with toddler meltdowns when their husband, quote, gets a break by going to work. And listen, I have thought this before. So when you say, you're like, oh, well, you sound kind of snarky. No, I can relate. I have been surrounded by small children while my husband is on a work trip, and feeling that insidious, it sure must be nice to go and get your meals prepared for you at a restaurant and have a quiet, clean hotel room. But if we flip that on its head to an actual Christian narrative, instead of letting that, like I said, insidious lie of, did God really say that your work was important? Did God really make you a woman on purpose? Did God really make you a man on purpose? Were you really given this charge of providing for your family and being kind of the one where the buck stops and holding that responsibility on your shoulders as a man? Are you really given the privilege of being a helpmeet and a hard worker in your home and the person that figures out all the logistics? And there's this whole idea, I'm sure you've probably heard all these social media posts about the mental load of women. Have you seen this whole thing?
No.
It's this whole trend, the mental load of women. No one could, no man could understand. I don't know how we're supposed to say no man could understand it. We can't even define what men and women are anymore. But, but that's another thing about feminism is they want to have it both ways. They want to say, like, only women could get this. You don't have a uterus. Like, get out of here on
Yeah.
the topic of abortion. And then they also want to say anyone that chooses to be a woman can be a woman. So it really comes back around to the bedrock of deceit and confusion. Satan is the father of lies.
Yeah.
He doesn't really care whether what people believe makes sense or not, as long as they believe it enough. Like Hitler's, mantra, say something long enough, loud enough, often enough, people will start to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to fight back against that and be willing to be the parents and the leaders who are steadfastly saying long enough, loud enough, and often enough that God's word is true. And I love that you are creating this resource. I'm going to go through this with my 5 teenagers in the spring. We're talking about these ideas all the time anyway, but I love the structure. I love the sidebars. I love the discussion questions. So we are going to have a blast with this. And I highly recommend this resource for parents. I mean, your first book, but I love that it has those extra resources. So I highly recommend this for parents that want to go through this book and then to do it with your teenagers and your middle schoolers, because we know for a fact that they're getting this messaging everywhere, whether it's commercials at the Super Bowl or whether it's a magazine cover at the grocery store, or
especially if they're going to go to college.
Yes.
If they're going to go to college, you got to prepare them for the buzzwords and what they're going to hear.
Absolutely. Alisa, anything you want to leave us with today?
No, that was great. I mean, we went all around.
We really
went
did.
Through progressive Christianity to Jen Hatmaker to Islam to feminism. I feel like we solved the world's problems today. So
pretty much. Jesus is king. His word is
That's
true.
right.
There we go. Solved. Okay. Tell us where we can find your books, where we can find you, where we can follow along for more.
Yeah, everything's on AlisaChilders.com. Books, wherever books are sold, you can get the books. And then I have a podcast called the Alisa Childers Podcast, the Unshaken Faith Podcast with Natasha Crane. And I'm on YouTube.
Perfect. Thank you
and
so
X.
much.
I'm on X now, fighting the Twitter battles.
I am not. I don't know that I ever will be.
I wasn't going to, but after Charlie was shot,
Yeah.
I just felt this real sense of urgency to get in the battle a little bit more. So I'm doing it right now. It's kind of like instead of my wind down time at night where I might watch a show, I'm Twitter battling for truth.
That sounds just as relaxing.
I'm really enjoying it though.
Oh, good.
But
I'm
I
glad.
may not do it forever.
Yeah, there's a season for everything. Well, I love that you're in the fight, and I am happy to be in the fight with you, and highly, highly recommend all of Alisa's resources. She is a voice for truth from the Lord, and I will always recommend that because, man, they're hard to find sometimes. Thanks for being here, Alisa.
Thanks, Abby.
If you enjoyed the MS for Mama podcast, I would be so honored if you would subscribe and follow along, maybe share with friends, or even leave a review. And if you want more content on motherhood and biblical responses to cultural issues, be sure to follow along on Instagram at m.is.for.mama.